Hi, Hannah.
Hi, Sam.
How is it going on this Sunday?
So cold.
Yeah.
So cold.
Yes. Very, very cold.
But we're going to be enveloped by the warmth of our dear friend's creativity. Again.
Yeah.
It's funny that we had Morgan Boecher on the podcast to talk about something that is not his book.
Mm-hmm.
And now here we are talking about his book. No, Morgan.
And this book is called
ChickenHeart. This is Morgan's second graphic novel. His first was a, I guess, semi-autobiographical. I don't know if you would describe it that way. A compilation of comics that he worked on during and about his transition, or just transitioning in general. And this is now a work of fiction. It is also about a trans person, a trans man. So, you want to tell us about ChickenHeart, Sam?
Yeah. ChickenHeart is a story about Jackie Locklear, who is a closeted trans man.
Mm-hmm.
And
he works as a comedian.
Works as a comedian in a big city. And he gets the news that his aunt, who is also trans.
Shoot. Sorry, honey. That's my...
That's good.
I have to go take a hormone. Just some quick gender-affirming care for a cis person.
Yeah.
How easy was it for me to access this gender-affirming care? So easy.
Well, probably not as easy as it could have been.
It could have been. But yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about how like if you are a cis woman who's taken birth control, then you've had gender-affirming care.
Yeah.
If you are a man who's had like any kind of treatment to prevent balding, then you've had gender-affirming care. Like, we conceptualize gender-affirming care as something that only trans people need because they're weird and different, but actually a lot of medical care is gender-affirming care for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, so Jackie Locklear is a comedian. He's a closeted trans man, and he had an aunt, Sheila,
who is also a trans woman, and Jackie gets the news that his aunt has passed away. Prior to her passing, Jackie hadn't really maintained a close relationship since he was a kid. He did know that she was rejected by the family, and she left to form a commune in the woods outside the city.
Called the ChickenHeart. Was it the ChickenHeart Love Commune or just the ChickenHeart Commune?
The ChickenHeart Love Commune, something along those lines, yeah.
And Sheila and Jackie had a special relationship when Jackie was a kid, and he always kind of like had it in the back of his head that he would hope to reconnect with her. But I think, well, I don't know that this is stated explicitly in the book, but it seems to me that part of what is holding him back from rekindling that connection is fear of like facing down his own gender. And Sheila has died by suicide, and Jackie decides to go to the ChickenHeart Love Commune for Sheila's funeral.
Yes. And this sounds like an interesting story and you don't want to know anything more about the story before we continue, you could pause it right here and you can go to your local independent bookstore and pick up a copy of ChickenHeart.
Yeah, you can also buy it online.
Or you could order it online through your independent bookstore. You could go to pretty much any major bookstore and get it too.
But I don't think that we're going to give any major spoilers today.
No, but yeah, if you're like, I want to read this book and then hear what Hannah and Sam's thoughts, maybe not necessarily on the book, but like the thoughts that they're having that come from the book, the discussion that they're going to have coming from the themes in the book.
Yeah, then you can do that. It's also like the art is really beautiful.
Oh, absolutely.
The humor is really charming. And it's not just about plot, although the plot has a lovely arc to it too.
Despite being a major weeb, I don't know much about comics. And I found Morgan's use of color in this very almost mesmerizing.
Yeah, the color is a cool visual cue that helps you understand, are we in a fantasy flashback? Are we in the here and now? Or are we in the woods at the commune?
Right. It often serves more as the backdrop than as the coloring of the characters.
Yeah, he didn't color in like the people or the things. He colored in, I think, mostly the background so that it's indicating setting.
Yeah. So the big thought that I had after finishing the book the other day is how, and so for our listeners who are just tuning in this episode and are not already a part of our millions of listeners worldwide, I come from a conservative Christian background. And so the things that, the thought that I had coming out of this is reflective of the thought process that I had that was kind of instilled in me as a kid and that I had growing up and as a young adult, which was that I took for granted the fact that as I move around society, I can look at someone and be able to accurately assume their gender. And the point of this book is not to question that assumption specifically.
No.
But it's because of my background that this book brought up this
novel thought for you.
Right, this novel thought for me that there is within a conservative viewpoint, there is this assumption that people present their gender in specific ways. And so it's not effortful to have to look at someone and determine their gender. So when
I think, like, to go further than that, it's not just that people present their gender in certain ways and that you can effortlessly and automatically clock someone when you meet them accurately. It's also that people naturally and always fall into one of two categories, and that all of the things that go along with each of those categories, which is to say chromosomal makeup, primary sex characteristics, such as, you know, whether you have internal and external genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, such as fat distribution, facial hair and body hair, height and musculature, and gender expression, which is like how we dress and style and hold ourselves in order to present our gender, that none of those things are separate, that they all go together and they all fall into two separate categories, and that these are mutually exclusive, perhaps like God-ordained categories, and that to deviate along any of those lines is unnatural and perhaps immoral and causes friction.
Right. And I think the causes friction part is the part that I wanted to hone in on, is that when confronted with trans people or non-binary people, I think the conservative ideology faces is this grating sense of their worldview that I was operating with this baseline assumption that colored my foundational view of society, and now I'm having to confront that and reflect on that. Why are you making me do this?
And, like, to be clear, my upbringing was not one of a degendered society where it was normal to not assume someone's gender based on looking at them. Like, growing up for me, it was very much normal to think there are boys and there are girls. I remember, like, referring to genitalia as boy parts and girl parts. So there was, like, a lot of collapsing of sex and gender. And I think that there was just the difference that we can identify between each of our upbringings with regard to, like, that idea that you can clock someone's gender by glancing at them, is that there was a lot of room in my upbringing for gender deviation. And in fact, it was kind of encouraged. Tomboys were a thing. You didn't need to always dress your baby in pink or blue, bows or overalls. And, like, I remember from, like, the earliest age that I can recall, it was just completely normal in my house that, you know, a parent would say, do you have any crushes on any boys? I would say yes or no. And they would say, any girls? That was just expected and normal in my house. And this was in an era where, like, the fight for marriage equality was actually only just heating up. So that might have been particularly progressive. So it wasn't that I, like, grew up with this, like, you know, utopian, or depending on your point of view, you might call it dystopian. I would consider it to be utopian. Degendered society where it was, like, already ingrained in me that, you know, physical characteristics don't dictate social roles. It was just that there was a lot more flexibility than it sounds like there was for you. When I was in, like, middle and high school, at the end of middle school, going into high school, I got involved with this organization called GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. And it was a anti-bullying advocacy organization. So like they did the Day of Silence is where like a lot of millennials would remember. They gave a lot of resources for gay straight alliances in schools. And then they would expand to other campaigns and days of action. And I was a part of their like youth organizing task force, basically. So like every summer I would get flown out to a training, like a 3 or 4 day long training about organizing and LGBT issues. And then I would go back to my school and work with my Gay Straight Alliance at my school to try to like, share out what I had learned and organize against bullying in my school. I identified with it because I got bullied a lot, although only, I think, tangentially related to being read as queer. And I think I was really only read as queer because I was like, I think that being queer is fine. But I was 12, so that was like a big deal. And I remember like going to one of these trainings and we had this workshop called like Gender 101. And like all of these concepts were presented. It was like a room full of teenagers and we were being taught like this postmodern breakdown. And I distinctly remember postmodern because like we were 15 minutes into one of these workshops and all of us were like, duh, like all of our eyes were crossing. We were so confused. And the facilitator said like, what you are learning right now is postmodern gender theory. So if you are confused by it or like struggling to wrap your brain around it, that's why. Because, we were a bunch of like 14, 15-year-olds. But it was presented to us like the breakdown that I just kind of presented by rote, right? That there are physical characteristics that people have that you can separate into these buckets of primary, second, and secondary sex characteristics. And that there are also gender roles that are like defined by what is expected that you should do about which primary and secondary sex characteristics that you have. And then gender expression, which is how you convey your gender to the world. And like that mind-bending breakdown of like, yeah, these physical characteristics are objectively true and they exist on our bodies, but everything, all of the meanings that we build around them are man-made. So like the idea that they all must go together, right? Like fat distribution more around the hips and the chest, less dense muscle tissue, softer facial features, whatever that means, and like a vagina and XX chromosomes all must always go together. And what that means is a woman. Like that's a made up thing.
Right.
We could categorize people based on all kinds of other physical characteristics and build all kinds of social meanings around them. The example that was given to us in this workshop was like whether you have brown or blue eyes. We could organize our society around those physical characteristics and it would make as much sense.
Well, and in fact, that has happened before, I think most notably in Nazi Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I'm so sorry that I just had that reaction to what you just said. Yes. We organize racial hierarchies based on physical characteristics that do exist, but that we ascribe a whole lot more meaning to than is accurate. And that is bad. We can all agree that when that happens, or I don't know, I wish we could all agree. It is apparent, I think, to more people, maybe, that ascribing all kinds of deep-seated meaning to that leads to very bad social consequences. So, I remember having that experience and being really fascinated by it as a teenager, and then, coming home, and, my friend Liz. Mm-hmm. Liz is going to come on the podcast sometime in the next year. I'm very excited about it. And, having a phone call with her where I, broke all this down to her, and she was like, I love this. We were just nerding out about this stuff. And I imagine that those concepts would not have reached you.
Definitely not at that age. In fact, I don't think those concepts reached me until probably pharmacy school at the earliest, which is very unfortunate and sad.
Yeah, because once you actually start learning about biology and medical care, it is necessary to start to break down those concepts because physical reality is not cut and dry like that.
The thing that I was thinking too was I think that maybe a part of why postmodern gender theory explaining that to a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds was difficult. It's not just because it's philosophically dense, but also because you were brought up learning sex and gender in such different terms and putting them into different categories. And so you were having to completely deconstruct that, rebuild and try and rebuild a new understanding of it.
And that's like, I would later learn that that's really what postmodernism means, is deconstructing a lot of stuff that you've taken for granted. And to be clear, they didn't say like, welcome to kids to your postmodern gender theory workshop. They said, we're going to have a workshop where we talked about gender. And then once we all started getting really confused, that's when the facilitator kind of leveled with us and said, here's what I'm trying to teach you right now. It's okay that you're wrestling with it. So yeah, that was a little bit of a tangent. But yeah, what was it about the book that made you have this thought about why must we feel the need to categorize someone based on gender immediately upon looking at them? Why must that be a frictionless process? What was it about this book that put that thought in your head?
Because I noticed myself trying to do it in the book. And I think there were characters in the book that came across as gender nonconforming in a way that I immediately ascribed to them one gender or another, even as maybe a trans man or a trans woman, and later realized that they weren't actually that. The issue was not that they didn't conform to what my expectation of their gender was. The issue was that from the get-go, I started having this automatic processing of what their gender was. And so I think for me, it was the realization that I am still caught up in that schema of typifying people into a certain gender.
I feel like I have a lot of conversations with like my non-binary loved ones where, and this isn't true of all of my non-binary loved ones, but a lot of them like seem non-binary to me. A lot of non-binary people might most of the time present feminine or masculine, and it is even now still for me more mechanical to remember to use they them pronouns, or to just like bear in mind that this person is not a man or is not a woman. But then there are certain non-binary people who present as a lot more androgynous, and when they tell me about how frequently they get misgendered, I'm like, I don't understand how. Because you give non-binary vibes, your secondary sex characteristics are non-binary, your voice and mannerisms are non-binary. I mean, which is not to say that like more androgynous people are more legitimately non-binary than like feminine or masculine people, but just like where I'm at, that like it is less effortful for me to immediately like read someone as non-binary, because there is room in my automatic like non-conscious schema for androgyny. Whereas like I think other people instinctively reach for, I gotta put you in one box or the other.
And to take it a step further, I think the thing arising from this that is most concerning is that what this boils down to is trying to put people in a box so that you can understand them without having to really understand them as a person. And that in the same way as like looking at someone solely based on their race or any other characteristic is dehumanizing.
Yeah. And the resistance to it comes from, well, but in order to absorb fully and engage fully with who you are as a person, I would need to rethink how I understand people in general and the world. And to that I say, yeah, you should do that. It's good. It's fun. And it allows you to be kinder and more expansive. It's pretty much win-win. Another thing I wanted to share in response to this insight that you had is like something that has been coming up often a lot for us, like related to climbing, because we can't have a podcast episode without talking about rock climbing and disability. Sorry. Is like this idea of, by existing in my body in these spaces, I cause friction. It's not anything that I'm doing. It is my existence that causes friction. And I think that that's like, that might be why I related to trans narratives and the trans struggle from a very early age. Or one of the reasons why. Something that happened to us recently was we went to a new rock climbing gym. And when you go to a new rock climbing gym and you're doing top rope, you have to get tested in this skill, because if you're bad at it, people could die. So like we were getting tested in that at this gym. And when I belay people, I look different from what you look like when you belay people. My hand looks different. My left hand does it differently from my right hand. I can belay people safely, but my grip looks different. So I was getting tested in belaying, and the staff member who was testing me said, first he said to you, "You're looking great, no worries." And then he said to me, "I'm not sure what's going on with your technique there." And I said, "Oh, my hand is partially paralyzed, so my grip looks different." And instinctively I said, "I'm sorry. I forgot I'm wearing a big bulky sweater and you can't tell by looking at me." And he kind of, in my estimation, he rolled his eyes at me and said, "Okay, well, that would have been really good to know beforehand." Mm-hmm. It came across to me as like exasperated. And I've done this belay test at 4 different gyms now. And sometimes I say something and that seems to come across as weird. Sometimes I don't say anything and that goes by totally fine. And other times I don't say something and then that happens. So it's like damned if I do, damned if I don't. Because these staff members have not like integrated into their worldview the idea that a disabled person would be belaying someone. And so by being a disabled person who is belaying someone, I am causing friction. And it's unfortunate. Mm. It's unfortunate to cause friction just with an immutable characteristic about you that, like, there's no reasonable way to suppress. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that my heart hurt for Jackie, because, like, the choice that Jackie is faced with in this book is, and this is like something that Morgan spoke to in our episode about trans women in sports. Do I make the choice to be true to myself, which I think for a lot of trans people, it's not so much a choice. Like, it is something that you must do. And in doing so, sign up for an existence where I am causing friction everywhere I go, just by virtue of who I am. And like, causing friction is the phrase I'm using right now. It could mean something like the story that I just told you, where someone was exasperated with me and I felt uncomfortable. Or it could mean real violence and like discrimination that messes with your life prospect, like your ability to find housing or employment, like your ability to meet your basic needs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Sheila dies by suicide. And something that's really refreshing in this book is that we get to know Sheila not merely as a tragic figure, and not even for a moment is Sheila represented as somebody who was weak or who gave up. Sheila is presented as somebody who had a great deal of joy and connection and beauty in her life.
And yet, despite that, was completely rejected by her family.
Well, I mean, a lot of the joy and beauty and connection that Sheila discovered in her life happened after she was disowned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe touching upon why you would say it was refreshing for the story to be told in this way is because I think that there are common storylines to fall on and this is a perspective that can be heard even within groups that are sympathetic towards the trans experience, where you might hear something said like, I support people being able to live their own lives, but I think that maybe trans people have a underlying mental health issue that needs to be resolved.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. That is like not the direction I was expecting you to go in, but that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this was actually something, conversations that I had with my family, that I think the concern maybe that, and concern in air quotes, because I think there's still a lot of bigotry towards trans people that gets reflected in this worldview. But part of the concern of like having trans people interacting with kids, like, the drag show story time, is that this confusion that some people believe this causes will lead to a mental health spiral that will be the cause of mental health illness in certain susceptible individuals.
Right. Because if you believe that there are two categories of humans naturally, then you believe that the only way that gender variance happens is if an idea is planted into somebody's head, and that could somehow like corrupt and harm them. There's a lot of anxiety about that. But like, if you understand the reality that gender variance is actually part of human nature and has been part of human nature for all of human history, then you understand that it is actually the suppression of gender variance. Actually, I should stop saying gender variance because I like the phrase gender expansiveness a lot better, because it sounds a lot happier. Gender variance implies that like there is a natural norm that is binary gender, like corresponding to sex assigned at birth, but gender expansiveness implies that there are some people who do identify that way, and also humanity is far more expansive than that. And I just think that's lovely. Yeah, if you understand gender expansiveness to be simply a part of human nature, then you understand that the pain and trauma and mental health struggles are not related to the gender expansiveness itself, but to the material realities that happen to people with gender expansiveness and like their inability to get their basic physical and emotional needs met.
Right. It's a difference between seeing it as a problem with the individual versus a problem with their surroundings and the society at large.
And I think like the way that Sheila's story conveys that is that we see again that she was not simply someone who suffered and suffered and suffered until she died. She was somebody who was traumatized and who did battle with this great darkness. And despite that, built this beautiful community and took great joy and meaning from it before she lost her life. Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of reminded of like, I remember being in high school. 2 of my siblings are adopted from Ethiopia. And so like when my little sisters who are from Ethiopia joined my family, like I started to learn a lot about like the realities of Africa and Africa in like the Western imagination. And like one thing that was very eye-opening for me was like starting to understand that like depictions of African poverty are very objectifying a lot of the time, because we as Westerners are invested in the idea of African poverty as something, A, separate and apart from the poverty that happens here in quote unquote developed countries, and B, something that means that like there is no joy, there is no happiness in that existence. It is an existence of like squalor and misery. And that is so dehumanizing in service of trying to convey the intensity of poverty, the severity of the poverty. We objectify the people who live in relatively lower resourced conditions, right?
And if I can add on to that, see that the imperial powers of the world didn't have a hand in
creating those conditions
for so many countries throughout Africa.
So much of the world, yeah.
And the one other thing I wanted to add to that was that, I think that gets to how this is something that, an idea that first popped into my mind from John Green's book, Everything is Tuberculosis.
That's going to be our next book episode.
Spoilers. But this idea of romanticizing poverty. And by romanticization, I mean stressing the dramaticness of it and
the drama and the dignity, the stoic virtue.
Right.
Of those living in poverty.
Right. It others them.
Yes.
It others African communities and African states and makes them seem as if they are incompetent, and that it is actually incumbent upon the white savior to come in and fix things.
Yeah. But I was going to say that, like, likewise, I think the figure of, like, the tragic trans woman dead mother who dies by suicide is dehumanizing, and that the character of Sheila complicates that beautifully by showing, like, in some of the most tender pages of the book. I think Morgan actually, like, identified a Sheila page as his favorite page in the entire book. Sorry if I'm wrong, Morgan. It was a poem, a love poem that Sheila wrote for her wife, and it depicted, like, their intimacy together. And so, like, we see that this person who suffered a great deal and whose death was a great tragedy to the many who loved her had, a beautiful life also with meaning and joy. And like that these are two truths that we must hold in tension. That the material realities for trans people are such that many of them struggle to get their basic needs met psychologically, physically, and emotionally, and that must be changed. And also that trans people and queer people and gender expansive people have like come together to build community and experience all of the good things in life, and will continue to do that. That's, I think, like what people are getting at a lot of the time when they talk about joy being an act of resistance. So the ChickenHeart Love Commune is presented as a place where misfits thrive.
That's their slogan.
That's their slogan. And Jackie hopes to go there and find belonging.
I think actually, is it where they thrive or where misfits belong?
I forget. So Jackie hopes to go to this commune and instantly find belonging and safety. And instead, Jackie really struggles. Like, he feels out of place. He doesn't have the skills necessary to meet the demands of this lifestyle. One of like the early jokes in the book is like, Jackie doesn't know what rutabaga is. Is it a root? Is it an herb? Like, Jackie doesn't know about gardening. If you pointed at a tree and said, hey, Jackie, what kind of tree is that? He would be like, I don't know, a tall one. And when he gets to the woods, it's not what he expected. The community is not what he expected, and the lifestyle adjustment is not what he expected. He's put off by, how do the toilets work? Like, how are you supposed to deal with the threat of bears? And I think it hits upon this fun dualism about like spending time close to nature, that it is like healing and nurturing, and it like connects you to these feelings of being close with something that is much bigger than yourself, and that is something that like feeds the soul. And also it's like dirty and uncomfortable and sweaty, and like there are all kinds of threats to your life that you have to constantly be aware of. And I thought that would be interesting for us to talk about in the book, and also like in each of our lives, because I feel like the natural world of Florida and the natural world of Massachusetts are really different. I think like you grew up camping, boating, doing a lot more naturey stuff than I did. And I thought of myself as an indoor cat for a long time. I would go to day camp, but the idea of like actually camping overnight in the woods was like pretty daunting for me. And I thought of that as something that a different type of person does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, as you pointed out, I like the idea that Morgan kind of challenged this idea that like everyone just can feel at one with themselves. And so Jackie's kind of confronted with this idea that I'm not feeling like I belong in the city. Mm-hmm. I'm having this kind of existential crisis going on here. And maybe if I go to this commune, I can figure myself out, because I think of myself as a misfit, and maybe this is for me. So Jackie goes to the commune, and he realizes that, or not realizes immediately, but he has experiences that are not that stereotypical oneness with nature type experience. It's very much a, oh wow, this is all so foreign to me. I did not grow up with this. I haven't experienced this before. It's all very unnatural, and it's not making me feel like I belong.
Yeah, and I think the phrase safe space is commonly mocked in conservative circles. And the idea of a safe space is like something that I think the conservative imagination is very threatened by. And I think part of it is the idea that if a space is meant to be safe, or is aspiring to safety, emotional safety, that what that means is you are never challenged there, that your every whim and comfort is catered to. And what the inhospitality of life in the woods gets at for me in ChickenHeart is that a safe space is actually about being in a community where the person who you are and your emotional needs aren't threatened, so that you can be challenged. And like something that I have grown to love about spending time in nature is what I like to, or I've heard other people term as productive discomfort. So like, it's a little cold, it's a little wet. There are bugs closer to me than I would prefer for there to be bugs close to me. I have to wait a little longer to eat my breakfast than I'm used to. And I have to do things to meet my basic needs. I have to do a little bit more labor. I have to haul water over from the well, or I have to work to build a fire. And it helps me to withstand a little bit more discomfort than I'm accustomed to. It helps me be more flexible, and it helps me really enjoy the fruits of my labor a lot. And that's something that like I really, it's closely coupled in my mind with spending time in the woods, spending time at the beach, spending time like close to the natural world. And I think it's part of Jackie's story.
Yeah, and the thing I was just thinking about as you were saying that was, as you mentioned about the conservative that turns their nose up to
the idea of a safe space.
The idea of a safe space. Mm-hmm. I think what they're getting or what they're thinking is that, oh, we're coddling the next generation. We're not developing and raising resilient children. Mm-hmm. And I think that what they misunderstand, and maybe something that I think I can speak of in my own life, is that having that ability to be in places where environments like the outdoors, where you are uncomfortable, while also having the people around you that are there to console you and teach you and be patient with you and not just tell you to man up and get over your feelings, but actually recognize your feelings and allow you to have those feelings and let you know that it's okay to have those feelings. And because of that, that safe space is really about not the actual physical environment, but the people there and the community that allows you to face and actually become resilient, rather than a place where you are just forced to adapt and you are told that your feelings don't matter. They're just thoughts within your brain and are something to push away and avoid.
Like I see a lot of frustration toward and about this concept of gentle parenting, and like understanding gentle parenting to be like immediately catering to the big feelings of the child, when in reality, like the ideal gentle parenting model would be like, I'm really upset because I don't want to put my shoes on. It might be, I'm going to be here with you and address your feelings of upset about putting your shoes on. And also I'm here to tell you that you do need to put your shoes on. So like you were saying, like making space for the emotions, and also saying like, yeah, like I'm imagining like a kid on a camping trip, right? Like, you don't want to be here. It is cold. You are sweaty and you're hungry and you're uncomfortable and you're really upset about that. I can see that. I would love for you to have some food. What we need to do for the food to happen is for you to go collect some firewood, you know, like coaching through, and also like presenting reality as it is, as non-optional. There's a way to do that is like so much less harmful than, as you say, like saying, your emotions aren't welcome here. Your emotions aren't safe here.
Don't cry. Don't pout. Don't feel. Just do.
Just do. Yeah. As opposed to like, I'm here with you in these feelings, and also here's what needs to get done. Yeah. And I think like Jackie almost gets like gentle parented by the woods. You know, he's like, I wanted this to be an immediate utopia where like I would be nurtured and safe and not challenged and like be able to come into my own just effortlessly. This is the place where I'm going to find myself. And instead what he finds is a place where he has to learn and be humble, and also where he is met with acceptance and a lot of space for what he's going through. So,
all right. So do we shift into how we think ChickenHeart helps teach us to love better in society?
Yeah.
I would say that, again, the big takeaway for me from my own background is I think I do a good job of accepting people as they are. Mm-hmm. But I think not seeing that acceptance as a place I have reached, but understanding it as a continual process, and knowing that I still have more I can do to challenge the way that I think, but more importantly, maybe to recognize those just baseline assumptions that come up for me about gender stereotyping, about, even as someone who would consider themselves fairly well versed at this point, I can still be curious about what assumptions I make about people and stories, so I can try to welcome people more, and so that I can let them know that I want to see them as their true authentic self.
I think my takeaway from this conversation is something that I can learn from reading more graphic novels, actually. Slowing down and being more still, taking time with the art instead of just trying to get through the plot as quickly as I can. I think that is not unrelated to the last point that we just touched upon about like creating a safe space for people to be challenged. Like so much of that is just being willing to be still and present and accept their emotions as they come. And I think that's something that I've shared with you over the past couple of days, is that personally, I've just been like reflecting a lot on the people who have done that for me and how important that has been. And like in reflecting on how I interacted with this book when I read it, kind of rushing through it, and how I sometimes interact just in interpersonal, like intimate conversations, rushing through to express or reach conclusions instead of like trying to be still and making space for my loved ones' feelings and insights, that it's not an expansive way of interacting with the world. And so without like trying to be hard on myself about it, if there are moments that I can catch myself and say, can I be more still and patient and open, that I think that will help me be more loving. And I think something that I love about our podcast is that it's light and happy and hopeful. And so I don't want to fault us for that, but I do feel the need to acknowledge that like we are living through a period of life-threatening persecution of trans people. And that we're talking a lot about how much we can learn from our trans loved ones and from trans art. And I think that's wonderful. And I think that that is part of resisting the terrifying moral panic of transphobia that we're living through. But I also like want to make space in our conversation for the fact that this is urgent and that people are living under very real threats. And so if we are inspired by these stories, if we can see the humanity in Jackie and in Sheila, and if we want like the Jackies and the Sheilas of the world to like be able to contribute and thrive, that we need to be vigorously advocating for gender affirming care, for protections against housing and employment discrimination, and for just like the legal rights of trans people to exist in like literal legal records, right? Like on their passport or whatever. Those basic civil rights are under a greater threat right now than they have been since before trans people became much more visible in the mainstream, and that the stakes are very high. And like we've been talking, I think, more happily and playfully, which is lovely, but that it's important to acknowledge how high the stakes are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that we are coming at this as two cis people.
Totally.
Yeah. Which, if you would like the perspective of a
trans person,
then you can listen to our last episode.
And some of the ways that we can be more loving to that end are to call our legislators and talk about how important it is that trans people be legally allowed to move through the world, be able to access public spaces, including bathrooms, that we want employment and housing discrimination protections to, depending on where we live, continue to include trans people, or like for that legislation to be introduced. And that, yeah, we care about trans people. We're not going to sacrifice them on the altar of, you know, the big picture of the fight against fascism.
Yeah, which I think some in the Democratic Party may be
inclined to do.
Yeah.
So Sorry to bring the tone down.
No. Hey, no, you brought up very good points. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think every episode needs to end on a super happy note.
No.
There is sadness in the world, and it's okay to point it out, and it's actually good sometimes.
Yeah, and that we should look to trans people for how we can best resist, because they've been resisting for generations and they're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I love you.
I love you too.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.